We begin this morning with the growing calls for President Trump's labor secretary, Alexander Acosta, to step down. One day after the legal controversy surrounding billionaire financier Jeffrey Epstein erupted here in New York City. Epstein appeared in a courtroom Monday pleading not guilty to charges he sex trafficked girls as young as 14 from 2002 to 2005. And he paid them hundreds of dollars in cash for, you guessed it, sex. But here's where Secretary Acosta comes into the picture. Back in 2008, Acosta was the U.S. attorney in Miami who oversaw a non-prosecution deal that allowed Epstein to plead guilty to a lesser state charge in Florida. That deal was widely criticized, too lenient, because Epstein served only 13 months in a county jail. And he was able to leave that jail 6 days a week on a work release program to his private office. Acosta has defended the plea deal as appropriate under the circumstances, including this past April before the House Appropriations Subcommittee.
As I was saying, the Department of Justice for the past 12 years has defended the actions of the office in this case. At the end of the day, Mr. Epstein went to jail. Epstein was incarcerated. He registered as a sex offender. The world was put on notice that he was a sex offender, and the victims received restitution.
13 months in county jail, 12 hours a day, work release. You consider that justice for the devastation of these girls?
Overnight, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi demanded Acosta step down in the following tweet. As U.S. attorney, he engaged in an unconscionable agreement with Jeffrey Epstein, kept secret from courageous young victims, preventing them from seeking justice. This was known by President Trump when he appointed him to the cabinet. Hashtag Acosta resign. And this morning, a new op-ed by the Miami Herald is also calling on Acosta to resign. That is the very same paper that brought to light the 2008 non-prosecution agreement through a series of reports last year. Joining us now, MSNBC contributor and MoveOn.org Chief Public Affairs Officer Karine Jean-Pierre, NBC News investigations correspondent Tom Winter, MSNBC contributor and executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion Tim O'Brien, and former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney, our legal mind this morning, Robert Bianchi. Tomas, you were at the courthouse yesterday, so we must turn to you first. Get us up to speed on Epstein's legal battle.
Okay, so where it stands right now is he's in detention. He's at MCC, which is a criminal complex or a holding complex downtown. It's by the courts. So he's going to be there, and he's going to be there till at least Monday. And that's because of the Bail Reform Act. As soon as his defense attorneys say, hey, we want to propose a bail package for him, whether or not the judge wants to grant it, whether or not the judge thinks it's appropriate, his defense is allowed to at least present that. So they're going to have a hearing on Monday. There's going to be a flurry of responses towards the end of this week. We'll see them. We'll hear about them. We'll report about them. And basically at that point, then on Monday, we assume that the judge that's going to be overseeing this case, Judge Berman, he'll be the one that'll decide whether or not Jeffrey Epstein can come out on bail or whether or not he's going to be detained pending trial. In this case, the factors against Epstein are so strong that he's a convicted felon, that he's somebody who is a registered sex offender, and that they did find those images during that search warrant on Saturday night at his house on the Upper East Side. Chances of him getting out on bail are very, very remote. Do we know when those images were from? I mean, it's stunning. The guy went to jail for it, registered sex offender, right.
And 4 days ago, no biggie, he's got a catalog of nude photos of women under the age of 18. How does that even happen?
Yeah, a quote, extraordinary amount of photos, either young girls or young women that were found semi-nude or nude. Some were found on CDs that were locked in a safe that he had. So I think when you look at it, when Judge looks at that doesn't look like a rehabilitative behavior. And that's what prosecutors said. That looks like behavior that is just continuing to go forward for him. So I think that's from a legal standpoint, that's the next thing for Epstein. And then I would expect immediately after that a motion to dismiss, a motion to throw out the case by Epstein's defense attorneys. They signaled that in court yesterday, saying, hey, we signed this non-prosecution agreement, and that should absolve us from any future charges. Prosecutors here in New York are going to take a strong stance against it, saying, hey, look, the document that you signed only said for the Southern District of Florida, and we're not the Southern District of Florida, so it's a moot point. So I think those are going to be the two next, from a legal standpoint, those are the next two big challenges, or the two next markers in this case, if you will.
That certainly does not sound like a rehabilitated man. can. Karine, let's talk about the growing calls for Labor Secretary Acosta's resignation. He is the one responsible for the non-prosecution agreement. Prosecutors in Florida had a 53-page indictment ready to roll. He stepped in. He bigfooted them. He met privately with Epstein's, Kirkland and Ellis attorneys. And the next thing you know, he's charged with a much lesser offense, and he's in jail for 13 months. Nancy Pelosi says time to go, Acosta. What's he have to say?
Yeah, I think in any other administration, Acosta would not have a job right now. His involvement with that deal, the non-prosecution deal, is just abhorrent. The fact that he only got 13 months, this is Epstein, only got 13 months, 12 hours, a work release, it's just completely insane. Those victims, those young girls, did not get any justice. And thank goodness that the SDNY is taking this up again. They're taking this very seriously. And what Epstein is accused of is horrific. And not just that, but whoever, any of the enablers, whoever, in whatever level they knew about this, need to be held accountable. It doesn't matter what party affiliation you have, how powerful you are, how well connected you are. You need to be held accountable, as well as Epstein.
Tim, in your latest piece entitled "Epstein's Arrest is a Worry for Donald Trump," what do you mean by that?
Well, I think there are two sort of skeletons in the Epstein closet that still need to be explored further. The first is, what other kind of information or tapes does he have on this large network of politicians, business people?
Which goes far beyond the president.
And it goes to people on both sides of the political aisle. It goes to influentials in Palm Beach and New York. We don't know what's there. The second thing is, how did Epstein manage his money, and where did the money come from? We only know that he had one major investor early when he opened up his fund, Les Wexner. Other than that, there's a mystery around how he was funded. And he was funded for a long time, and he was funded in a way that allowed him to support a lifestyle that included about $100 million in real estate. He needed substantial income just to afford that lifestyle. So he clearly had money coming in. It wasn't just a Potemkin village.
But now where does he get it from? He has to have had millions of dollars in legal fees. It's unclear what he does for a living now, and he's a registered sex offender. How does he afford this lifestyle? Yesterday, the prosecutor said he's a man of unlimited means.
Well, and so that, I think, raises that to me is going to be one of the key things investigators are going to have to sort out here, is the extent to which Epstein was able to use blackmail or other information to compel people to fund him or play ball with him who otherwise might not have. And I think if that door gets opened up, you're going to get this very seedy look at how power functions in New York and in Palm Beach.
We should note that while the president did have a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, he had been on his airplane multiple times. According to court documents that were filed by a lawyer representing 3 of Epstein's victims, President Trump then banned his former friend from Mar-a-Lago because he sexually assaulted an underage girl at the club.
Wait a sec, though. That's been put out over the last day on this. Two things. That lawyer who represented the women who had been attacked by Jeff Epstein, he actually agreed with Trump not to put him under a deposition. He had subpoenaed him for a deposition. They then reached a gentleman's agreement in which Trump went in for a private interview. It was off the record.
But he did say he was very cooperative.
He said he was cooperative, but we never know actually what information was shared as part of that. I'm not saying
Isn't it amazing that we call it a gentleman's agreement when we're talking about dudes and young girls?
I mean, I think this is the thing that so infuriated the assistant director of the FBI yesterday, Bill Sweeney. I mean, he was about as stern as I've ever seen him at a press conference. He runs the New York field office of the FBI, and he really was upset with this idea of we don't ever talk about these things, that there are adults that are fully aware of the fact that these acts are occurring, and nobody ever comes out and says anything, and people don't step forward and say this is wrong and we need to do something about it. I mean, it was a little bit of a lecture in morality from the assistant director, but this is a guy that sees this type of behavior all the time, obviously knows the case file here and knows things that we don't know yet with respect to Epstein, and was somebody who was really disgusted about what we saw yesterday. I mean, a gentleman's agreement over what? We're talking about somebody who's allegedly involved and has already pleaded guilty to, in the past, his involvement with underage girls. This is, this is like kind of gross.
Robert, you shared this outrage. You said say this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I think that they should be looking into Acosta about this particular deal. I used to prepare these deals, and these deals were created. Miami Herald did a great job through the defense lawyers. They were dictating the terms of the deal.
So walk us through this so people truly understand. When you say you used to prepare these deals as a defense attorney?
As a prosecutor.
As a prosecutor. So you would prepare these. In what circumstance would you ever go to the defense team and have them dictate to you, here's what you're going to do, Bob?
Absolutely not. Stephanie, the first thing that got me about this case, well before this indictment came down, was that you're meeting with a defense attorney in the Marriott, and you're discussing this case after the FBI is going internationally, not just in the United States, getting up to 80 victims and more victims on the plate. They had a 53-page indictment prepared that they may go forward with, and then all of a sudden there's a meeting in the Marriott, and it's going into a non-prosecution agreement. I handle these cases as a prosecutor and defense lawyer. I have one where a person does a singular act of taking a minor over state lines, and their offers are in the area of 7 years in federal prison plus state time, and that's just for a single person, not a conspiracy to sex traffic women from across the world. So any prosecutor or any defense lawyer looking at this, there can't be a singular one. I challenge anyone to come forward and say that this non-prosecution agreement, which was prepared by the defense essentially, which hid from the victims everything that was going on, hid from the judge essentially what was going on, is anywhere near what a typical non-prosecution agreement is.
And they extend it to the co-conspirators.
This is what I need someone to explain to me.
Yeah.
Why would you extend immunity to the co-conspirators? If I'm Alexander Acosta and I'm cutting a deal, what am I getting out of Epstein that makes me want to hook up the co-conspirators, except for the fact that the people who he traveled with were among some of the most powerful people in the world?
Right, so this non-prosecution agreement says the 4 accomplices, they're immune, they're covered. And
why? Why would he? Help me understand why one would agree to something like that.
I don't see a cooperation agreement in there. That's the thing that doesn't make sense. There's no indication that Epstein ever provided any additional information to any other case of any sort of significance. And I know there was this discussion about the Bear Stearns asset management and a couple of those funds that blew up during the CDO crisis. But you know what? That never held water, and he never testified at that trial.
Prosecutors involved in those said that he never gave material.
Well, they would have to put it in the non-prosecution agreement. But there's one other permutation that you can kind of miss. And any other unidentified co-conspirator.
Any other? Why? Why would you offer something like that?
You don't do it. It just, you know from looking at this as a lawyer that this was dictated by the defense to hide it from the media, to protect everyone associated with this. He gave nothing. You give non-prosecution agreements for minor, low-level offenses, not something like this, especially when the FBI, look at this, the police that were investigating it, the FBI, everyone was outraged by this, and yet very few people said it.
I knew it, and I'm merely
We
an
know
SVU
why they do
enthusiast.
this. This happens when people are thinking about running for political office later in their lives and are thinking about lining up money and lining up influence. And when they're in a role as a prosecutor or in any kind of public service role, they're trading off a present favor for a future debt.
Okay, then to that point, Karine, I want to share what Michelle Goldberg wrote in her op-ed for the New York Times, calling this plutocratic rot. She writes, powerful elites enabled the financier accused of trafficking underage girls. She lists the following examples. Alexander Acosta oversaw the non-prosecution agreement in 2008, and she adds the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, under Democrat Cy Vance, asked a judge to downgrade Epstein's sex offender status from a level 3, which is the most serious, to a level 1, the least. What do you make of that?
You know what rings at me when I hear that and I look at this case as a whole, or the situation as a whole, is how broken the justice system is, and how just the inequalities of this. I mean, you have a very wealthy man, millionaire, billionaire, however you want to argue that, who is well connected to both, Democrats and Republicans. We have to be really honest here. Who is, like I said, well connected, rich, wealthy, and who gets essentially a sweetheart deal. He gets a slap on the wrist in Florida for what he did there. And if it was anybody else, any of us regular people, we would not have gotten away with this, in particular people of color and poor people. And that's what screams at me when I read this, besides the fact that these young girls did not get, they did not get justice.
vulnerable girls.
Just briefly, as important as, and I've read the non-prosecution agreement. We have a copy of it. As important as all the other factors around it are, to me, there are 8 specific violations of U.S. criminal code that are named there. Some of them are very similar to the charges that were brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York yesterday. It says that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office found these violations. You have 8 specific violations. And for some reason, that went away.
That carry up to a life sentence, by the way.
Essentially a life sentence, exactly right. And I think
carry up to a life sentence. He got 13 months, and Jeffrey Epstein went on to joke about it.
Prison in a very lenient term, where he was allowed to leave for work release during the day. I mean, it wasn't even that he was allowed to just be there for 13 months in a regular jail facility. Looking over the state, I have the state police, I have the state attorney file, which includes the Palm Beach Police Department investigation, and reading over that and reading over the statements that they were able to get from the victims. It's just, I don't want that to ever get lost as we talk about this, because obviously there's a lot to talk about here. When I look at that, the things that they say, the things that these girls had to deal with because they're all under the age of 18, Epstein ordering them to take off the clothes. They talked about his imposing physical presence. He's 6 feet tall, 180 pounds, according to his Florida law enforcement records.
These girls didn't have very much money.
They did not have very much money,
homeless.
and they came from,
And they were allowed to call them prostitutes. A 14-year-old that he pled guilty was a prostitute. A girl that can't even consent under the law, who's being abused. They had the temerity to allow them to go in and say that. And by the way, Stephanie, to your point with the judge on Cy Vance, the judge looked at that and said, I have never seen a prosecutor come into court to lower the registration requirement for a sex offender with a case like this. The judge was outraged. She saw it as well. It's disgusting.
Well, Cy Vance, if you're watching, you are welcome to join me on TV. I would love to understand why you would want it to go from a level 3 to a level 1.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.